Welcome to FedScoopTV. I'm Camille Tootie, FedScoop's editorial director, and I'm here with Burr Sutter from Red Hat. Welcome.
Thank you.
Let's talk a little bit about the open source trends. What do you see in the space?
Well, there's a ton happening in open source right now, and open source is actually having a significant impact on everything within enterprise IT or government agency IT. Specifically, if you look at something like big data as a simple example, a lot of what's happening in the big data ecosystem was born out of open source. So what I really love seeing happening in open source right now is pretty much everything that matters, everything that a technical person touches has some basis in open source at this point. So everything is free and available as a tool for you to use and experiment with in most cases. And then of course there's support available to you from large organizations like Red Hat as an example.
And what are the specific areas that developers care about when it comes to open source?
So what's funny is I actually used to run a large organization, a nonprofit organization for our Java user group and also my own developer conference. And free and open source were two of the key words to get people into the audience in many cases. So developers just love free and they love open source. And they love the ability to actually get their hands on the technology and really dive down into it to really see how it works. In many cases they can actually learn best practices just by learning from the open source code base, just digging into that open source code base and going, oh, that's how that technique works, or how that best practice works, or how that design pattern works. And so what we're seeing now is pretty much anything that can be turned into software is being turned into software and then actually made available in open source, whether it be through an academic initiative, a student within a university and his professor working together, or in many cases, large organizations are basically finding that they can donate back to the open source community with components and technology that really isn't a core competitive advantage for their organization. You know, if you think about the way we can do networking, the way we can do virtualization, the way we can actually do things in many middleware categories, and middleware being the layer that developers touch that actually then interacts with the underlying operating system and underlying software stack. You know, any of those components can be open sourced. And so what in the open source community overall, open source ecosystem, you're seeing a ton happening in the big data space, ton of energy right there, right now, and I really think that's an industry born from open source by itself. It's a massive movement within our open source ecosystem. You see a ton happening right now in mobility and mobile. So for anybody who's interested in going mobile or building a mobile-based application, you're seeing a ton happening in open source, like jQuery Foundation, the jQuery mobile capabilities. You're seeing a ton coming out from Red Hat specifically within the JBoss team. We're working on Eclipse-based tooling, and Eclipse, of course, is a free IDE for developers where developers can spend their day building applications. And we have tools right within Eclipse where you can actually say, I want to drag and drop and build a new jQuery mobile application and see what it looks like on an iPhone or an Android phone or an Android tablet right there within the IDE itself. So there's just a ton of little innovations like that and big innovations happening in the space. So it used to be that it was just developers touching all this open source technology, maybe getting down to the command line, running their Maven compiles or Ant compiles or looking at the Ruby gems. But now what we're really seeing is even business analysts and other higher level IT executives and IT personnel getting involved with open source so they can actually go in there and look at their business processes, look at their business rules, actually see what their business activity monitoring console looks like in their dashboard. So just a ton of goodness happening in open source right now.
So fast forward a few years, how do you see that use of open source evolving?
The use of open source will continue to evolve certainly in a positive direction. It's one of those things where the model is such that you can't actually short circuit it, right? It's kind of harder. It's harder to get cheaper than free. And so free and the ubiquitous aspect of that where people can just sit down, download it, try it, see if they like it, extend it, delve deep into it, talk about it within their community, support the community by answering questions, providing bug reports, or even patches to the actual source code. That concept is, to some degree, human nature. It's kind of how we'd all love to be able to work if we could take the competitive pressures out of it and say, let's just build a better, greater ecosystem. So it's truly happening in the open source world, and it'll continue to evolve along those paths. So I think you'll continue to see open source move into more and more places where traditional closed source has been pervasive. And then you're going to see open source almost invent whole new categories like it has in the big data space, where basically open source has created that movement. And so you're going to see more of that happening, like with data center virtualization, I think, is happening in a significant way. You're hearing a lot about as a service, whether it be infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, backend as a service. There's tons of these initiatives out there now, and more open source will find its way into all of those ecosystems and all of those environments.
Thank you, Burr, for chatting with FedScoopTV. We appreciate it.
All right, thank you.